The story of Hamburg is not a fairy tale of magical restoration. It is a gritty, painful chronicle of a city that looked into the abyss and decided to climb back out. When the bombers returned to England in the summer of 1943, they left behind a silence so profound it seemed the city had ceased to exist. Yet if you listen closely to the streets of Hamburg today, you hear the hum of a metropolis that refused to be extinguished. This documentary invites you to walk through the timeline of destruction and renewal. We will explore how the Venice of the North became a testing ground for total war, and how the survivors, armed with little more than shovels and stubbornness, cleared the mountains of debris to lay the foundations of the modern European powerhouse we see today. From the terrifying nights of the firestorm to the architectural triumphs of the 21st century, this is a journey through memory and stone. It is a testament to the fact that while buildings can be burned, the spirit of a city resides in its people. Welcome to the history of Hamburg's resurrection. The camera glides over the sleek, modern glass facade of the Elbphilharmonie, reflecting the grey waters of the Elbe River before sharply cutting to a grainy black and white aerial shot from 1943, showing a landscape that resembles the surface of the moon more than a European metropolis. This is Hamburg, Germany's gateway to the world. A city that today stands as a testament to economic power and architectural innovation, yet its foundations rest upon one of the most terrifying tragedies of human history. To understand the modern silhouette of this Hanseatic giant, one must first look beneath the pavement into the deep scars left by a firestorm that consumed oxygen, buildings, and tens of thousands of lives in a single week of the Second World War. We often speak of the resilience of cities, but Hamburg's story is not merely about stacking bricks back together. It is a narrative of survival against an elemental force unleashed by man, a catastrophe so absolute that it required the complete reinvention of urban life. The images we see of the pristine Ulster lakes and the busy container terminals today hide a ghost city, a phantom map of medieval alleyways and timber-framed houses that vanished in a whirlwind of phosphorus and high explosives. This documentary explores the journey from that absolute zero point, where the streets were buried under 43 million cubic meters of rubble, to the resurrection of a powerhouse that refused to die. As we walk through the Speicherstadt district today, with its red brick warehouses standing tall against the northern sky, we are walking through a miracle of engineering and human will. But the question remains, how do you rebuild a city when the very reference points of its existence have been erased? How do survivors, traumatized by a fire that melted asphalt, find the strength to clear the debris with their bare hands? This is the story of Operation Gomorrah, the total destruction of Hamburg, and the unprecedented decades-long labor that stitched the city back together, transforming a graveyard of ruins into a beacon of rebirth, the gateway to the world. Hamburg before the storm. Before the sirens began to wail, Hamburg was the beating heart of German maritime trade, a city defined by the dense, rhythmic clatter of its port and the elegance of its merchant class. Visuals from the late 1930s depict a bustling metropolis where the smell of roasted coffee and exotic spices from the east wafted through the narrow, crooked streets of the Gängeviertel, a dense neighborhood of half-timbered houses leaning precariously over canals. The spire of St. Michael's Church, affectionately known as the Michel, watched over a skyline pierced not by skyscrapers, but by the masts of tall ships and the chimneys of ocean liners, creating a silhouette of prosperity that had grown over centuries of Hanseatic independence. The atmosphere was one of cosmopolitan pride, where wealthy ship owners built white villas along the Elbe Chaussee, while the working class crowded into the vibrant, tightly packed districts of Hammerbrook and Rothenburg-Sort. Archive footage shows the busy hustle of the Jungfernstieg, the city's promenade, filled with trams, bicycles, and citizens unaware that their architectural heritage was living on borrowed time. The water of the Ulster Lake reflected a city at the height of its industrial prowess, a visual tapestry of red brick expressionism and Gothic revival that signaled Hamburg's status as the second largest city in the Reich, a jewel that seemed untouchable by the chaos brewing on the political horizon. However, beneath this veneer of trade and tradition, the city was already transforming into a cog in the machinery of war, a shift that would ultimately seal its fate. The visuals of peaceful market days slowly crossfade into images of shipyards ramping up production, steel being forged, and the swastika flags draping over the Grand City Hall. The dense population centers, constructed of dry timber and situated dangerously close to industrial zones, were a disaster waiting to happen, a vast urban tinderbox. The beauty of pre-war Hamburg, with its canals and crowded tenements, was tragically perfectly designed to feed the inferno that was approaching from the skies. The strategic target, Fortress of the North Hamburg, was not chosen at random. It was the lungs of the German submarine fleet and a vital artery for the Nazi war effort, making it a priority target on the Allied maps. We see the massive dry docks of Blohm and Voss, where the hulls of U-boats were welded together amid sparks and smoke, creating the steel sharks that terrorized the Atlantic convoys. The camera pans over detailed reconnaissance photographs used by the Royal Air Force, circling the oil refineries, the ball-bearing factories, and the vast railway yards that funneled supplies to the Eastern Front. Hamburg was no longer just a city of merchants. It was classified as a fortress of the North, heavily defended by flak towers that rose like concrete monsters above the parks and plazas. The strategic logic of the Allies was brutal and mathematical. To cripple the German war machine, they had to destroy the workers' ability to work, which meant targeting the residential districts surrounding the factories. We visualize the plotting rooms in High Wycombe, England, where Bomber Command traced lines across the North Sea, calculating fuel loads and bomb mixtures designed for maximum incendiary effect. The tension in the city was palpable. The air raid sirens became the new soundtrack of daily life, and the blackout curtains turned the vibrant port into a dark, silent void every night, waiting for the inevitable roar of engines that would signal the beginning of the end. In the summer of 1943, the conditions aligned for a catastrophe of biblical proportions. An unusually hot and dry July had turned the attic timbers of Hamburg's buildings into bone-dry kindling. Visuals of the sun beating down on the slate roofs underscore the vulnerability of the city, while meteorological maps show the stable air currents that would later trap the smoke and heat. The Allies named their plan Operation Gomorrah, a chilling biblical reference to destruction by fire and brimstone. As the British fleets gathered on the runways, Hamburg went about its business, a city holding its breath, unaware that the technology of destruction had advanced to a point where it could erase a millennium of history in a matter of hours. Operation Gomorrah. The week the sky burned the night of July 24th, 1943, marked the beginning of an apocalypse as nearly 800 British bombers unleashed a new, terrifying tactic, the window. We visualize thousands of strips of aluminum foil fluttering down through the dark sky like metallic snow, blinding the German radar screens and leaving the city's defenses helpless and confused. Then came the markers, Christmas tree-shaped flares of red and green that guided the bombers to their aim points with terrifying precision. The initial explosions shattered windows and rooftops, exposing the wooden interiors of thousands of buildings to the rain of incendiary stick bombs that followed, turning entire city blocks into interconnected bonfires within minutes. But the true horror arrived on the night of July 27th, when a specific combination of humidity, heat and bomb density created a phenomenon never before seen on such a scale: the firestorm. Visual descriptions from survivors paint a picture of hell on Earth, where thousands of individual fires sucked in oxygen from the surrounding area, creating hurricane-force winds of superheated air that raged through the streets at 150 miles per hour. Trees were uprooted, roofs were torn off, and people were pulled into the flames by the sheer vacuum of the fire. The sky turned a bruised, bloody purple, and the roar of the blaze was so loud it drowned out the anti-aircraft guns, creating a sonic wall of destruction. The devastation was not just structural, it was elemental, with temperatures in the center of the firestorm reaching 800 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt glass and turn brick into slag. We see archival footage of the towering pillars of smoke rising 20 feet into the air, visible from dozens of miles away, a tombstone of smoke over the dying city. The asphalt on the streets bubbled and liquefied, trapping those who tried to flee, while the iconic canals of Hamburg boiled. In this cauldron, the distinction between military target and civilian home evaporated completely. There was only fire, consuming the rich heritage of the Hanseatic League and leaving nothing but ash in its wake. The human experience. Survival in the inferno. For the civilians on the ground, the experience of Operation Gomorrah was beyond the comprehension of the human mind, a descent into a primal struggle for breath and shelter. We visualized the claustrophobic terror inside the basement bunkers, where families huddled together as the oxygen was sucked out by the firestorm raging above, the candles flickering and dying as the air grew thin. Survivors recount the terrifying decision they had to make: stay in the bunkers and risk suffocation or carbon monoxide poisoning, or run out into the street where the heat was intense enough to ignite clothing instantly. The narrative focuses on the sensory overload, the smell of burning sulfur, the screaming wind, and the absolute darkness pierced only by the glow of burning phosphorus. Mothers soaked blankets in water to wrap around their children, dashing through streets where the buildings on both sides were walls of flame, navigating a maze of falling debris and melting tram lines. We described the heartbreaking scenes of those who sought refuge in the canals, staying submerged in the water for hours while debris rained down around them, their only sanctuary from the heat. The psychological trauma was immediate and profound. People emerged from the shelters covered in soot, eyes wide with the 1,000-yard stare, and unable to recognize their own streets or even where their homes had stood just hours before. The chaos separated families, leaving children wandering alone in a landscape that looked more like the surface of a volcanic planet than a European city. This was a humanitarian catastrophe of unprecedented scale, with approximately 34,000 to 43,000 people perishing in the firestorm, many reduced to nothing more than ash shadows in the cellars. The visual narrative shifts to the morning light, filtering through the thick, acrid smoke, revealing the survivors emerging like ghosts from the underworld. They were covered in grey dust, coughing, carrying suitcases with the few pathetic belongings they had managed to snatch. The resilience of the human spirit was tested to its absolute limit here. There was no time to mourn, only a numb instinct to keep moving, to find water, to find kin, to escape the death zone that Hamburg had become. The day after, a silent ghost city. When the smoke finally cleared days later, the scale of the destruction revealed a landscape of utter desolation that shocked even the most hardened military observers. We pan across high-resolution images of the aftermath, endless square miles of hollowed-out facades standing like jagged teeth against the horizon, with mountains of rubble spilling into the streets. Districts like Hamburg were effectively erased from the map, transformed into dead zones, where entry was forbidden due to the risk of collapsing walls and unexploded ordnance. The silence that hung over the ruins was heavy and disturbing, broken only by the occasional crash of masonry or the distant sound of a shovel hitting stone. The city had lost nearly half of its living space. Over 250 Zauzadulland apartments were destroyed, leaving 1 million people homeless and wandering the countryside or crowding into the few remaining undamaged areas. We visualize the Trümmerfrauen, rubble women, and forced laborers beginning the grim task of recovering bodies, often wearing gas masks to cope with the stench of decay that permeated the summer air. The infrastructure of civilization, water, electricity, gas, had been severed, forcing the once proud citizens of Hamburg to live like scavengers in the shells of their former lives, cooking over open fires and sleeping in makeshift shelters constructed from salvaged doors and bricks. Yet amidst this moonscape, symbols of the city endured. The tower of St. Michael's Church miraculously remained standing, battered but unbroken, rising above the sea of ruins as a solitary beacon of hope. This visual contrast, the vertical defiance of the church against the horizontal devastation of the residential blocks, became a rallying point for the survivors. The destruction was so total that some Allied planners suggested abandoning the site of Hamburg entirely, but for the people who remained, this was still home. The profound loss of cultural heritage, of the libraries, the churches, and the old town, created a void in the city's identity, a blank slate of grief upon which they would now have to write a new future. The Great Clear-Up, mountains of debris. The first step toward rebirth was not construction, but excavation. Hamburg was buried under more rubble than any other German city, a staggering 43 million cubic meters of broken stone and twisted metal. We visualize the establishment of the Trümmerbahnen, narrow-gauge railways laid temporarily through the ruined streets, chugging back and forth like mechanical ants, carrying away the carcass of the old city. The sheer physical effort required to clear the streets was monumental, performed largely by hand in the early years, with lines of citizens passing buckets of debris, cleaning mortar off bricks one by one to be reused for reconstruction. It was a time of grit and dust, where the currency of the day was a loaf of bread and the ability to work. The debris had to go somewhere, and thus the geography of Hamburg was permanently altered by the creation of rubble hills. We look at the Oyendorfer Park today, a green and pleasant landscape, and peel back the layers to reveal that these hills are artificial, built entirely from the crushed remains of the city's bombed districts. These are not just mounds of dirt, they are the graves of the city's past, containing the pulverized remnants of furniture, personal mementos, and the very walls of the pre-war homes. The visual transformation of these sores on the landscape into parks symbolizes the city's ability to metabolize its trauma, turning the waste of war into spaces of leisure for future generations. This period of clearing was slow and dangerous, fraught with the peril of unexploded bombs lurking beneath the masonry, a threat that continues to haunt Hamburg to this day. We see the stark imagery of the Eisenfresser, iron eaters, massive cranes and crushers that eventually arrive to speed up the process, gnawing through the ruins with industrial efficiency. The psychological impact of seeing the ruins cleared was profound. With every street opened, the city began to breathe again. The clearing was not just a logistical necessity. It was a cathartic act of reclaiming the ground, a declaration that the firestorm had not won, and that the layout of the city would emerge once more from the chaos. Planning the new city. Tradition versus modernity. As the ground was cleared, a fierce ideological battle emerged over how to rebuild. Should Hamburg restore its medieval, crooked charm, or embrace the future with wide avenues and modern concrete? We visualize the blueprints and master plans spread out on tables in temporary offices, where architects like Konstantin Gutschau, who had planned for the Nazis, and modernists clashed over the city's soul. The decision was made to avoid a total reconstruction of the old, cramped city. Instead, Hamburg would become a modern, car-friendly metropolis, loosely grouped and green, breaking away from the density that had made the firestorm so deadly. This was a controversial pivot, sacrificing the intimacy of the old quarters for the functionality of the new. However, the city refused to lose its characteristic red brick identity. We see the construction of the Grindel high-rises, the first of their kind in Germany, symbolizing a new vertical living style, standing in stark contrast to the restored Baroque facade of the Michel. The planners enacted a strict code requiring the use of red clinker brick for facades, ensuring that even modern buildings paid homage to the Hanseatic tradition. This visual consistency is what saved Hamburg from becoming a soulless concrete jungle. The new structures, though angular and functional, wore the same skin as the old warehouses of the Speicherstadt, creating a visual bridge across the chasm of the war. The reconstruction of the port was prioritized above all else, the economic engine that would drive the recovery. We see the rapid rebuilding of the quay walls, the bridges over the Elbe, and the warehouses, funded in part by the Marshall Plan. The new Hamburg that emerged in the 1950s and 60s was a hybrid city, rational, spacious and pragmatic, yet anchored by the few restored landmarks like the City Hall and the Stock Exchange. It was a compromise between memory and progress, a city designed not just to house people, but to function as a modern international hub, signaling to the world that Hamburg was open for business once again. The economic miracle. The phoenix rises by the late 1950s and early 1960s. The Wirtschaftswunder, economic miracle, had taken full hold, and Hamburg had reclaimed its title as Germany's gateway to the world. We transitioned from the grey tones of the rubble years to the vibrant technicolor of the swinging 60s, where the port is once again a forest of cranes and the river is thick with cargo ships from every corner of the globe. The re-emergence of Hamburg was not just industrial, it was cultural. The Beatles playing in the gritty clubs of the Reeperbahn is a visual marker of this new energy, a city that was once again connecting with the youth and culture of the West, shaking off the grim shadow of the Third Reich. The skyline continued to evolve, filling the gaps where ruins once stood with glass, steel, and the ubiquitous red brick. We see the construction of the Kurlbrand Bridge in the 1970s, a sweeping curve of cable and concrete that became a new landmark, symbolizing the connection between the port and the hinterland. The residential districts were rebuilt, parks were replanted, and the population swelled back to pre-war levels. The scars of the war were not erased but integrated. The ruins of the St. Nikolai Church were intentionally left standing as a hollow spire, a permanent anti-war memorial and a viewing platform, a jagged finger pointing to the sky, reminding the prosperous new city of the price paid for its resurrection. Today, Hamburg stands as one of the wealthiest and most livable cities in Europe, a testament to a reconstruction that was as much psychological as it was physical. The camera sweeps over the Hafen City, Europe's largest inner-city development project, building directly onto the old port infrastructure, blending the historic warehouses with futuristic architecture. This continuity is the essence of Hamburg's rebirth. From the ashes of Operation Gomorrah, a city emerged that is robust, forward-looking, yet deeply respectful of its history. The fire burned the buildings, but it forged a collective identity of resilience that defines every brick laid since 1945. Standing today on the viewing platform of the ruined St. Nikolai Church, looking out over the panoramic view of the rebuilt city, one is struck by a profound sense of duality. The modern skyline, with its shining concert halls and busy avenues, is a victory of life over death, of construction over destruction. Yet the black, soot-stained stones of the memorial beneath our feet serve as a permanent anchor to the past, a silent scream that ensures the horror of the firestorm is never forgotten amidst the prosperity. Hamburg teaches us that true resilience is not about erasing the scars, but about wearing them with dignity, integrating the tragedy into the very fabric of the future. The rebirth of Hamburg was an act of collective defiance. It was achieved by the hands of the Trümmerfrauen, the vision of the planners, and the endurance of a population that refused to abandon their home on the Elbe. They did not just build houses, they rebuilt a community, restoring the soul of the Hanseatic League from a pile of ashes. As the sun sets over the port, turning the water into liquid gold, we see a city that has metabolized its darkest hour to fuel a brighter, stronger existence. If this documentary amplified your vision of the strength of human reconstruction, subscribe to the channel to follow other stories that shaped our world.